Well, good morning, everybody. It's Monday morning, and glad you joined us for another week here on Coffee with Doc. And it's August the 30th. This month is about to get away from us. But glad you joined us here this morning for a little sip of coffee or whatever it is you happen to have as your morning beverage or afternoon beverage, whenever it is you're watching this. Glad you've joined us. And what we're doing is we're kind of walking through the book of Joshua. I don't know if we'll go all the way through the book, but that's what we've been doing, is just walking through the book of Joshua. And just to review just a little bit, we're in Joshua chapter 9 last week, and we were talking then about, well, I can't find my notes, but one of the things that we were talking about was how the Gibeonites deceived the nation of Israel, and they got what they wanted by deception. And we talked about the two strategies of the enemy. That one of his strategies is just a full-out frontal assault. He makes no bones about it. And the other thing is that he will use deception, and that's what we talked about last week, was how he used deception. Now this week we're going to go into Joshua chapter 10. I'm just going to use today to summarize that chapter and kind of set the stage for what we're going to talk about for the rest of the week. And you remember I titled last week that it is what it is unless it's not. And it turned out to be pretty snotty. And this week we're going to look at something that may sound harsh. It may sound ungodly. It may sound unforgiving. There are a lot of words that we could use, but I'm telling you that this is the word of God, and he's telling Israel how to deal with their enemies. Now I want you to keep in mind that the same enemies that Israel faced then, we as a nation, America, allied with Israel, are still facing those enemies today. So don't get put out with me. Don't get your little snowflake heart melted and your other garments in a wad, because I talk about the enemies of Israel, because they're still alive and they're still emblematic or symbolic of the enemies we face every day in our life. So we've talked about here the entering of the land of promise being the equivalent of the continuing battles that we face. They face there and we face in ours every day. One of them last week we talked about was deception. So these are continuing battles. Now the 10th chapter of Joshua reminds us that we must be absolutely ruthless when it comes to dealing with the enemies of the Christian life. Now I've titled this study this week, Don't Let the Kings Live, or Don't Spare the Kings. Now again, that's going to sound harsh, but I want you to stay with me. And let me give you a summary of this chapter and then call your attention through the week to a few important principles. Number one, we need to remember this book of Joshua is an account of the conquering of the land of Canaan. In other words, this is the fulfillment of the promise God gave Abraham. He brought him to Israel for a while, then down to Egypt. They were in bondage. And then in the bondage of Egypt, he brought them out for 40 years. They wandered. Now they've come under the leadership of Joshua and they've crossed over. And coming out of Egypt is tantamount to being saved. That's like our salvation. But then coming into the promised land is walking in the fullness and the provision of the Christian life. And we've talked about the land God promised to the Israelites. And although God gave them victories, there was a strategy involved, and Joshua had to come and listen to God to get that strategy. But really it was a classical military maneuver. Israel moved into the center of the country. They didn't come in from one side or the other, but they came in at the center of the country, and they cut it in half as they moved westward toward the Mediterranean Sea. And when they got to the coast, then they moved south, and they conquered all the land of the south. And finally, then they turned back and pushed north and completed the conquest. Now, Jericho and Ai were the first victories as they moved to cut through the center of the country. It's interesting to note that each time they came back to their base camp, which was Gilgal. Gilgal was their home base. Now, I want you to remember that because this is going to come back later in the week. Remember, Gilgal is their base camp. So after making a treaty with Gibeon, which we saw last week to the south, the 5 kings of the south got worried about that, and they came against Gibeon. And Gibeonites, who had just been spared by Joshua, they sent word to Joshua, and true to their word, they came to aid the Gibeonites. And they routed those enemies, and as they fled before them, the Lord rained down hailstones, and he killed more that way than the Israelite soldiers did. So God was totally involved in what was happening to the enemy of Israel. And then when the day was almost done and nightfall was beginning to settle and they were going to be able to escape under the cover of night, Joshua spoke to the Lord, and then he called on the sun to stand still. And it did for about the length of a day. Now, folks, when a president, when a king, when a army general or anybody else speaks to the Lord and then calls on the sun and tells the sun to stop till we get this done, you know you're on the wrong side unless you're with him. And when the day was almost done, he spoke and it did stand still. And after the defeat, these 5 kings fled away and they hid in a cave. And Joshua told his men to roll stones against it and to seal the cave, and then to pursue and utterly destroy all of the people to the south. Now afterwards, Joshua has the 5 kings brought out of the cave, and in the presence of the people, Joshua had his men to symbolically place their feet on their necks of the 5 kings. Oh, isn't that horrible? To put your foot on the neck of somebody. That's another story for another day. But he says they put their feet on the necks of the 5 kings, and then after pronouncing their defeat and humiliating them in front of all of Israel, then it says Joshua ordered them to be killed, and he hung their bodies on 5 trees for everyone to see. Now, you say, well, that's a horrible thing to do. You shouldn't do that. Don't you realize we're fighting the descendants of the same people today? And somehow, some of them escaped, and Joshua was doing what both Moses and God had ordered, that they were to be killed, that they would be put to death. And you say, well, how horrible that is. Let me remind you, the enemies in the promised land represent the enemies in the life of every Christian. And my friend, whether it's dealing with terrorism in the real world today, the material world, dealing with terrorists, dealing with Islam, dealing with the descendants of these people, whether they're in Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, wherever they happen to be, we have to be ruthless. We lost 13 service members, most of them Marines, this last week. You cannot negotiate with the enemy who lives by deception. Did you hear me? You cannot negotiate with the enemy. You must put them to death. Whether it's in a material world like ours, and that's hard to say, but that's what they want to do. They want to kill us. They want to kill Christians. That's what they're doing right now in Afghanistan. And the parallel to that in the Christian life is you and I have to be absolutely ruthless with the sin that we find in our life and the kingdom of sin that we find. So there are three things I want us to see in this story that parallels our Christian life. And we're going to look at that, and we're going to talk some about present day events, and we're going to talk about some about our spiritual life as we walk into this new land that we call the Christian life. So join me tomorrow, and we'll get started on looking at what happens when you enter a new life and what must happen to those enemies we encounter there. God bless you. We'll see you in the morning, Tuesday morning. God bless you.